Welcome to Dialogue, a true crime conversation. I'm your host, Rebekah Sebastian. Thank you so much for tuning in to the third part of this 4-week series on justice, injustice. Today's interview is really important to me because some of you may know that in addition to this podcast, I also host a true crime trivia show called Yellow Tape. Now, the show has gone virtual during the pandemic, and you can learn more about it in the show notes if you're interested. I started the show 3 years ago, and from day one, we've donated proceeds, modest proceeds, from ticket sales to the Innocence Project because once I learned what wrongful convictions were, how often they happened, it was very hard for me to look away and not do anything, even a small thing. So when today's guest, Jeff Deskovic and Exonoree, reached out about being on the show, I did my research and found that his story is one of an absolutely tragic wrongful conviction whose conviction was overturned in large part because of the work of the Innocence Project. And I just knew I wanted to talk to him. Jeff's story personalizes and gives context and humanity to the topics we've been covering here the last couple weeks on Dialogue. His story is hard to hear at parts, but it's so important, and I'm really grateful to Jeff for trusting me with it. Please note that this episode will be in 2 parts. Turns out it's a long story, a compelling story. So make sure you're subscribed so you're notified when part 2 comes out next week. Also, Jeff's foundation and other resources we mentioned will be listed in the show notes, so please have a look there and see if there's ways you can support Jeff in his mission to help others who are wrongfully incarcerated and just to learn more about the subject. Okay, here's part 1 with Jeff Deskovic. Jeff, thank you so much for being on Dialogue, a true crime conversation. Really happy to speak with you tonight.
Really happy to be here.
Good. Well, it's especially cool because even though we're really sitting down to get to know one another tonight, we did actually meet, though we didn't plan it. We just happened to both be at the same place at the same time. And I don't want to divulge too much about the location because that's a separate podcast project that I'm doing that I can't announce yet. But I can say that I was at a press conference and you were announced as somebody that was going to come in and be making a statement. And it was right after we had booked this interview. So that was really cool to get even just a couple minutes to meet you in person.
Yes, the universe was speaking to us. That was like a synchronistic moment.
I completely agree. I got chills when I heard your name, and I had one of those moments where I thought, oh, I am at the right place doing what I'm supposed to be doing. You know, we don't get a lot of moments like that, but that was one for me. So I'm really glad you reached out. I'm really happy to be hearing your story in your own words. You have a really unique journey and a story not many can tell. And so I think we should just start with your case. You're speaking to us tonight as an advocate, an attorney, a free man, but that was not the case for a good part of your life. So maybe why don't you introduce yourself and tell us what happened?
Sure. So I'm Jeff Deskovic, and I spent 16 years in prison in New York, state prison system, wrongfully convicted of a murder and rape, which I did not commit. I was 16 when I was arrested. I turned 17 by the time the trial rolled around. I was wrongfully in prison from age 17 to 32 prior to DNA exonerating me 14 years ago, not only exonerating me, but also identifying the actual perpetrator.
I mean, you have that down pat. Like, you can say those bullet points so casually, I guess. But it's a lot to take in for the average person, right? If you take any one of those things, you were 16. That's really, really young. You went to prison for, is it 16?
A murder. Yeah, I went to prison for 16 years.
16 years. So you haven't even been free for as long as you were incarcerated.
That is correct.
And it was for a murder and a rape of a classmate. So somebody in your social world at large, and you didn't do it.
Correct.
So that's a lot. That's a lot for people to hear and to understand. And can you talk us through that year and what happened in those days around? Well, I guess we should talk about the victim. Her name was Angela Correa. I want to say her last name right. Correa. What happened in the days after her murder, and why and how did your name become part of the story?
Sure. So the year was 1990. She went missing November 15th, 1989, and her body was found on November 17th, 1989. 1990 comes in. I was arrested at that point. But Peekskill, we're in Peekskill, New York. It's Westchester County. Think suburbs, think middle class, think racially diverse. And I became a suspect because the police interviewed many students in the high school, and some of them told the police that they might want to talk to me. So outside of school, in the apartment complex where I lived at, which ironically was right next door, literally to the high school, I was kind of like the center of the attention. It was me and one other boy, and pretty much whatever I said would be what we would do. So if we would go play basketball, if we were going to swim, if we were going to play Monopoly or video games, or any of those other stickball, you name it, we did it. And I was very active, and there was a lot of other kids that lived in that apartment complex, and even kids from the surrounding areas used to come over, and we all got along, and we all did what kids do, like the activities like I'm discussing. So I was pretty popular there. It was a different story in the high school, though. I had much younger years. I had been skipped in a grade, so the kids in the public school, they were actually a year ahead of me. So they were into things that I was not. They were into drinking beer and keg parties and chasing girls, dating, and I was in the other world. So I didn't quite, and I wasn't familiar with any of them either. So I didn't quite fit in. So as a result, I was like tight, quiet to myself. You might say I was socially awkward. And I guess the theory in the kid's mind is that people that don't fit in commit heinous crimes. I guess that's the underlying theory. So that's how I arrived at the police radar, the first factor. Second factor was that the police thought that I was overly upset at the victim having been murdered. So was I upset? Yeah, absolutely. Did I overreact? Well, yeah, I guess you could say that. That was really my first brush with death, and this was a classmate, somebody I knew, albeit from a pretty great distance. But then again, it the murder impacted many students in the high school and many people throughout the whole city of Peekskill, to the point that free mental health services were offered to anyone who wanted it. So in that aspect of it, it really wasn't all that unusual. A confirmatory factor was that the Peekskill police, they got a psychological profile from the NYPD, which purported to have all the psychological characteristics of the actual perpetrator. And I had the misfortune of matching that. So all those reasons how I became on the police radar. So for about 6 weeks, the police played this cat and mouse game with me, in which half the time they would talk to me as if I was a suspect, and the other half the time they would pretend like they needed my help to solve the crime. They would say things like, the kids won't talk freely around us, but they will around you. Let us know if you hear anything. Stop in from time to time. They would ask me opinion questions and congratulate me that my opinions were correct. They made me feel important. As background, before I was a teenager, the career that I wanted to have when I grew up was actually to be a cop. And so this unexpected early opportunity to do this quasi-police work along with my age, 16 years old, was how the police were able to pull the wool over my eyes.
Oh, man.
Another factor is that I came from a single parent household. My father was never involved in my life in any aspect. And so that directly intersected with the good cop, bad cop routine, in which one officer pretends to be a friend and the other one is this really aggressive person. And of course, the purpose of that is so that when the person being questioned becomes frightened, you obviously would look to a friendly face for assistance. So eventually the police got me to agree to a polygraph test, otherwise called a lie detector test. They told me some new information came in on the police file and they wanted to share that with me, and that would allow me to in turn be more helpful to them. But first I would have to pass this polygraph test. And so the next day, rather than report to the school, I instead went to the police station where I had heard through the rumor mill that other people had been polygraphed. Because it was a school day, my mother and grandmother with whom I lived, they thought I was in school. They had no clue that anything was wrong, and therefore they did not call around looking for me. Now, the police drove me from Peekskill, which was in Westchester County, to the town of Brewster, which is in Putnam County. So across county lines, 40 minutes away by car, which meant that I had no idea of where I was, and I had no independent way of leaving.
Wow.
So I did not have the polygraphist himself was a undercover. He was a Putnam County Sheriff's investigator who was dressed as a civilian. He was pretending not to be a cop, so he never read me my rights. So I didn't have an attorney present. I wasn't given anything to eat the entire time I was there. They gave me a 4-page brochure which explained how the polygraph worked, but it had a lot of big words in it which I didn't understand. But then because I thought I was there to help the police, I pushed past my own concern and had the mentality that, what does it matter? All right, I'm here to help the police. Let's just get on with it. So from there, they put me in a small room, and the polygraphist gave me countless cups of coffee. Seems pretty clear in hindsight that the purpose of doing that was to, get me all wired up. So from there, he attached me to the polygraph, and then he launched into his third-degree tactics. So he invaded my personal space. He raised his voice at me. He kept asking me the same questions over and over again. So as each hour passed, my fear increased in proportion to the time. To he kept that up for like 6.5 to 7 hours. So it was particularly frightening to me because I was not used to talking and interacting with adult males. So towards the end of the interview, he made a statement to me. He said, "What do you mean you didn't do it? You just told me through the polygraph test result that you did. We just want you to verbally confirm it." So that really shot my fear through the roof. And at that point, the officer who had been pretending to be my friend, he came in the room and told me that the other officers were going to harm me, but that he was holding them off, but could not do so any longer. You have to help yourself. Look, just tell them what they want to hear. They'll stop what they're doing. You can go home afterwards. You're not going to be arrested. Being young, naive, frightened, 16 years old, not thinking about the long term, just being concerned with my safety in the moment. I mean, I was in fear of my life. The fact that I didn't know where I was, that nobody else knew where I was
Oh my
either,
gosh.
loomed very large in my mind. I was overwhelmed emotionally and psychologically. And, then there was this threat and the false promise. And so I made up a story based upon the information that he had given me in the course of that interrogation and in the 6 weeks run up to that. By the time it was all said and done, I had collapsed on the floor, curled up into a fetal position, crying uncontrollably. So obviously, I was arrested. I was charged with a murder and rape.
Wow. My follow-up question was going to be about false confessions and how many of us have a hard time understanding how they happen, even though we can kind of understand the things we've heard. But when you lay it out like that and create that picture and that image, it's visceral. I can feel it and I can imagine it. And I have teenagers of my own that I'd like to think would call me or say I'm not talking unless they talk to an attorney. And I just can't be sure they would. I mean, a 16-year-old's brain, as we know, as rational adults, is so far from developed. And it's hard to think outside that moment, like you said. Um, it's
Yeah, I'd like to comment on that just for a quick second.
Please.
That so coerced false confessions have been the cause of wrongful conviction in 25% of the cases. And while adults have falsely confessed, particularly vulnerable populations are youth, which I was, and people with mental health issues. And I'd like to further add that the innocence of suspects actually works against them because they think, well, if you didn't do anything and you don't know anything, what can actually go wrong, what could actually happen. And actually quite a lot could actually happen. And then sometimes people even have thoughts, that, well, if I ask for a lawyer, then I'm going to look guilty. And that's
Sure.
totally wrong mindset. But at 16, I didn't even get to that point. Whenever they read me my rights, for example, I did not understand. And every time they said, if you can't afford an attorney, one will be provided for you, and anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. My mind went to like a civil court. And I remember always thinking to myself, court, what are you talking about? What court? We're not going to court.
Yeah.
So
It's like a
yeah, so I
naivete. It
just,
was a
yes,
naivete about you, that
yes.
that worked against you, even though it came from this innocent
Right.
posture.
Exactly. And then I was further thrown off balance by this constant, good cop, bad cop routine where again, half the time they talk to me as a suspect, and the other half the time they pretend like they needed my help to solve the crime.
So
So go ahead.
it was an aggressive tactic on their part. I mean, we've
Yes,
heard
it
of
was.
cops pushing the envelope, nudging a little too hard, you know, maybe tweaking circumstances a little bit, but this seems fairly aggressive and intentional. Why do you think their tunnel vision was set on you? I understand that you fit this profile, people mentioned you, but it seems that they were working way too hard to get you to fit this crime. And at that point, my second question to that would be, did they know at that point that your DNA was not present there? There was no physical evidence, or were they still looking for that and keeping you while they were looking?
Well, I don't believe that this was all a good faith error. So I think that they were just trying to solve, just to solve the case. I mean, I'll tell a little bit more of the story. And that's another fact that I think was important. Is that my mother really had no idea that any of this
Oh,
was going on. She knew that they spoke with me the first time, and then after that, she didn't want me to speak with them, and they knew that. But look, I was 16, and that's like the age where we know better. Our parents are stupid, we know better,
mhm.
and what could possibly happen. But actually she knew better than me, but I didn't know this I didn't realize that at the time. So that was another aspect. So let's get into the DNA. So my wrongful conviction was atypical, because in the sense that the DNA excluded me before I was convicted.
Right.
So right, so there was semen found on the victim. Okay, by the way, the prosecutor. So the police wanted to arrest me before the day of the false confession, and they consulted with a prosecutor, and the prosecutor said, "Look, you have no evidence. Don't make an arrest. Wait for the DNA to come back." But they
Mhm.
weren't content to do that, and that's why they got involved in this whole delivering me to this other polygraphist who carried out this get the confession procedure. That's why they went through all of that, because they didn't want to wait for the DNA to come back. And had they waited, it would have excluded me, and none of this would have ever happened. So nonetheless, circumstances played out as they did. So the semen didn't match me. So one day before officially getting the test results, the the prosecutor rushed to the grand jury to indict me so that he didn't have to present the DNA evidence to the grand jury. So in order to explain away that DNA, the prosecutor got the medical examiner to commit fraud, to commit perjury. So let me explain. When an autopsy is done, there's written and audio notes, which are taken as the medical examiner or the coroner makes the findings. So it was only 6 months after doing this autopsy, only after the DNA doesn't match me, that he suddenly remembers that he forgot to document medical evidence. Right, it's hundreds of autopsies later. He suddenly remembers, right?
Right, right.
That the medical evidence he found showed that Angela, who a 15-year-old immigrant from Colombia, who'd been in the country for about a year and a half, very sheltered life. As I understand it, she never went anywhere unless her older sister and her parents were with her. That he found medical evidence that she was sleeping around. So, in other words, in order to wrongfully convict me, they were willing to trash her reputation.
Oh, just like it gets worse. It just gets
Right.
worse.
Yes. And then taking it a step further, the prosecutor mentions another youth by name, another student that he claimed had slept with the victim, but he never set the proper evidentiary foundation. So he never had a DNA sample taken from him. He never even called him as a witness. He just made the unsupported argument to the jury. At the same time, the public defender that I had uh, essentially didn't defend me. So he rarely met with me. He never interviewed my alibi witness or call him as a witness at the trial. I was playing wiffle ball when the crime happened. He never explained to the jury what the DNA not matching me meant. He never used that to argue that that proved that the confession was coerced and false. At times, he argued to the jury that the confession never happened. At other times, he was arguing that the confession did happen, but that it was coerced At still other times, he was arguing that the confession happened, but it was false. So he was all over the place. So that really blew his credibility to the jury. When it was time to cross-examine the medical examiner and expose his fraud, he stood up in open court and he said, "You're going to be pleased to know that I don't have a single question for you."
Your lawyer said that?
Yes. When I hadn't decided if I was going to have a bench trial, which is decided by the judge, or a jury trial, which was a consideration because of the presence of the confession,
Yeah.
my lawyer came to me and one day and said that the trial judge went to him and told him to pick a jury because he didn't want to be responsible for finding me not guilty. My lawyer was supposed to put that on the record and ask the judge to recuse himself because, number one, it wasn't proper for him to limit my decision like that. And secondly, that's a very prejudicial statement, for him to say, and it suggests that he was being impacted by the prejudicial pretrial coverage. Every time I made the court appearance, it was a major media moment with virtually all of it from a guilt presumptive oriented perspective. So go ahead.
Sorry, just to interject. So you think
Yes.
selfishly for his career, he didn't really want to be the one to make that verdict?
Yes, I do.
Okay. God.
Yes, I do.
Thank you for listening to another great podcast on the Crawl Space Media Network. I'm Jared Ortis.
I'm Nick Porchetta.
I'm Samantha Vasquez.
And our show is Even the Podcast is Afraid.
We release episodes every Monday, bringing you the real life and fictional horrors of true crime, the paranormal, and the unexplained.
We combine in-depth research from our host Jared and our elbow-deep researcher and writer Stephanie Kemmerer,
while bringing you a comedic approach to serial killers, cults, demons, and all sorts of weird and macabre history.
But if you're interested in everything morbid and grisly, then listen to Even the Podcast is Afraid for free on your favorite podcast listening app, and visit our website at eventhepodcastisafraid.com for even more information on the show.
While you're there, check out some of our fan-favorite episodes like the disappearance of Michael Rockefeller, the sadistic serial killer couple Fred and Rose West, the true story of the Amityville Horror, and more.
Be sure to subscribe to the show or be cursed.
And now we will let you get back to the awesome podcast you were listening to from the Crawl Space Media Network.
Then my lawyer should have never represented me because of a conflict of interest. So this other youth that the prosecution was falsely claiming had slept with the victim, he was represented by another member of the Westchester County Legal Aid. So that conflict prevented the defense from asking him for a DNA sample. It prevented the defense from calling him as a witness.
Oh.
Now, when I was interrogated, it wasn't videotaped and there was no audio tape. There was no signed confession. It was simply the cop's word for it. And as a result of that, they were able to leave the threat and false promise out of their testimony. So I wanted to testify at the pre-trial hearing to add those facts to the record, but my lawyer wouldn't allow me to. He said that he hadn't decided if I was going to testify at the trial or not, and so he didn't want there to be any prior testimony from that. Because he said that nobody tells the same story in 100% the same way, and if there was any differences, then the prosecutor could make it appear as if I was lying, even if I was not.
Mm-hmm.
But in a larger sense, that didn't really make a lot of sense because firstly, if the judge believed me, then the statements would have been ruled involuntary, and therefore they would not have been admissible, and lacking any other evidence, there would not have been a trial. And secondly, if it really went that badly, I didn't have to take the stand at the trial, and if I didn't, then the prior testimony could not be used. But then when I got to the trial, he wouldn't allow me to testify there either. He told me it wasn't his job to prove that I was innocent. It was up to the prosecutor to prove that I was guilty, and he didn't think that that had happened. So that might be a legal principle, but it's a very naive way to practice law. In reality, if your client's innocent, you have to try to prove that they're innocent, or else you run a risk that they might be wrongfully convicted, particularly in a confession case where there's an 80% conviction rate. So you have to answer that confession. You have to explain that confession. You have to try to disprove as many aspects of that confession as you can through alibi and other evidence, except that he didn't do any of that. Now, I want to also add there was an additional fabrication on the part of the police, as if all that wasn't enough. So, not content with having coerced a false confession out of me, they also falsely attributed a statement to me. They claimed that I told them that I didn't know if the perpetrator ejaculated or not, as a way of trying to explain how did this DNA not match Deskovic, but yet he's still guilty. Well, when he said that to us, he was really speaking about himself. He was just using the third person.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing, though, is that number one, at 16, I didn't, that word was not in my vocabulary.
Mm-hmm.
And second of all, that statement didn't appear in any of the police reports about the confession when they took notes down. It only appeared in the notes that they made after the DNA didn't match me. So it's clear that they fabricated for that purpose. So another thing I wanted to mention was that the victim's clothing, including her bra, was entered into evidence. And one of the statements that I made in the course, the coerced false confession, was I said that I ripped her bra off. So the jury asked to see the bra.
Mm-hmm.
And we thought, meaning the defense lawyer and I, we thought that was a bright moment, that they were thinking like we wanted them to think, because there's some bras that you cannot rip off.
Mm-hmm.
So they asked to see it, and that's when the judge informed us that the clothing items, including the bra, had been left in the courtroom over the weekend. And he claimed that the orderlies, the people, the janitors, he claimed that the janitors must have accidentally threw the clothes out. And so he substituted the bra for a photo in which, as he put it, I'm quoting now almost exactly verbatim, you can almost see the bra in the photos.
I'm gobsmacked.
And so all of that added up, I was wrongfully convicted. I remember on the day of the sentencing, I begged the judge to overturn the verdict, and because I was innocent, I referenced the DNA, and he told me on the record, he said, maybe you are innocent. And now you would think that a judge who thinks that or says that is going to overturn the conviction.
Intervene.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's his job. And he could have done that by reversing any number of rulings that he made against me in the course of the trial, including the evidence throwing out that I referenced. But he took the easy way out, which was to sentence me to a 15 to life sentence, because I had been charged as an adult and I was given an adult sentence, and therefore sent to a men's maximum security prison.
Oh my God. Okay, so you're telling this story now as a very grown-up adult with a law degree, I might add. Congratulations, right. We'll get there.
Yes.
But in the moment, you're 17. Do you just not feel heard? Do you feel like you're in a bad dream? I mean, how grounded in reality were you? Like,
no, I was not. I was not. I couldn't believe my own ears.
Yeah.
I was like beside myself.
Yeah.
I was like, did I just hear that right?
Yeah. I actually can't even imagine everything going through your mind. And your family and your mom.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, they were stunned. I mean, they completely believed in the justice system, and, at some point they convinced me to believe in it. And so it was just kind of like an article of faith that we lived with for close to a year, that the justice system, that I was going to be found not guilty because I didn't commit the crime and the justice system worked. So just to add a little bit of color to this.
Sure.
So the first three charges that were read off, the the jury found me not guilty of the first 3 charges. And so my mother actually jumped up in the courtroom and, with her hands raised, like somebody might if a touchdown has just been
Yeah.
scored, and cheering, the first 3 charges, and then out of nowhere, guilty, guilty, guilty. You could have, the enormity of the moment, it's like people's hearing just stopped.
And this attorney that you had, what did he have to say for himself? What did he say to you when they are taking you back to prison?
He, he, he just said to Gigi, he didn't say much of anything. Let me just back up a half a second. So immediately he was like, he wanted to speak to the judge, and so I was stunned, and my mother was stunned, and as the judge and my lawyer and the prosecutor were exiting the courtroom to go into the courtroom chambers, I remember that my mother and my aunt, they asked the court officer if they could sit next to me, in the and they asked the judge, and he looked at the court officer like if he was silly or something, and just said no. I mean, it was all the court officers in the world. I mean, you think they're going to break me out? It
Right.
was just, but just to get to the human side of that.
Yeah, there was, honestly, it feels like you just had nothing was on your side from
It
the
was not. And I
get-go.
was exactly. And I want to add that, again, I was really in over my head
Yeah.
because I was 17. I had never been arrested for anything before. I had no experience with trials. I knew nothing about the law. I never had been inside of a courtroom, and here we are, meaning me, my mother, we're being told, that this lawyer is the best trial lawyer that Legal Aid Society of Westchester has. And, and whenever I did ask him a question, he's saying things like, look, look, I'm the lawyer. Let me do you just sit back. Let me do my job. Look, you already thought you knew better than an adult already. Okay. And you see what that got you. Just let me do my job. So, what am I supposed to say to that other than just go along with it? Again, keeping in mind that I'm 17, and, even certain strategic decisions, I didn't understand really. I mean, I wanted to testify. He's not allowing me to, and he's giving me, his rationale for that. And he refused to allow my mother to be included in that decision and consultation. And the same thing, I had an uncle who was a marshal who was in law enforcement, and he wouldn't consult with him. So he just took a very strict view of attorney-client privilege, to where the privilege actually worked against me.
Yeah. Yeah.
One of my biggest regrets about that whole trial was that I did not take the stand, that I did not testify. But I would like to continue on with the story because I naively thought that the court system got better the higher up you went, but
Oh,
it didn't turn out to be that way.
okay.
So I went to the appellate division, where my issues on appeal were, firstly, that the police violated my Fifth Amendment rights by the way they questioned me, which was still highly questionable even without the threat and false promise on the record, and my innocence, which was wrapped around the argument that there was legally insufficient evidence, that the prosecution hadn't proven guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, and that the verdict was against the weight of the evidence. Obviously, the evidence being thrown out was another issue. And there was another issue was that, while polygraph test results are not allowed to be used as a courtroom, this trial judge, through a ruling, he created like a back door by which he allowed the polygraphist to tell the jury that I failed the polygraph exam.
Oh my gosh.
So that was very prejudicial. So that was another issue. And then there was another 4 issues of law. So the appellate division wrote that that I was not in custody, that I was free to come and go as I wanted, which, I was across county lines at 16, not knowing where I am and having no money. I mean, no, I was not free to come and go as I wanted. And they ruled that the statements were voluntary. Then they wrote that there was overwhelming evidence of guilt, which is a head scratcher because the DNA didn't match me. And and all they have is this confession under this highly questionable circumstances, right? And they got rid of all of my other claims, including the evidence issue and the polygraph issue, the test result. They got rid of all of the claims in one more sentence. They said that they had looked at the rest of my issues and found them either to not be preserved for review or not having any merit. And they ruled against me 5-0. Now, as terrible as that decision is, that's the most that any court ever wrote. The re-argument motion my lawyer filed, which pointed out all the different ways that their decision was running contrary to the facts and contrary to the case law, that was rejected in one word: denied. The New York Court of Appeals, our highest court, they declined to give me permission to appeal to them. I lost in federal court because my lawyer gave the court clerk gave my lawyer, this was a different lawyer, not the same lawyer, but the court clerk gave my lawyer the wrong information pertaining to this new filing procedure. So my petition arrived 4 days too late, which former Westchester DA Janine Pirro, who has the Judge Show and is a Fox commentator,
Sure.
and this staunch advocate for due process, where was all of that before? Her office took the position that those 4 days were prejudicial to the government, and the court should simply rule that I was late without even getting to my innocence issue. And that's what the court did. So now I'm time barred. So I challenged that ruling at the Federal Court of Appeals in front of two judges, my Judge Rosemary Pooler and future U.S. Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor.
Wow.
And my lawyer argues that this was not a delay by me or my attorney, but caused by the court clerk. I don't think we need a law degree to know that that's a valid argument. Secondly, she argued that upholding a ruling like that would cause a miscarriage of justice to continue, which links back to the DNA and the innocence as a contextual issue. And thirdly, she argued that overturning the procedural ruling would open the door to more sophisticated DNA testing.
Okay.
But once again, off the DA Pirro's office opposed. Once again, the court ruled for the district attorney. So Justice Sonia Sotomayor upheld that ruling. That one was okay, according to her. We then re-argued the case in front of them, requesting that all the judges on the circuit hear the case and make a decision. But the re-argument motion was denied. And then the U.S. Supreme Court declined to give me permission. So now my appeals are exhausted. And at that stage, because they're exhausted, I no longer had an attorney.
And can I ask, over what period of
Yes.
time were all those appeals and denials
Yes.
happening?
Yes. So that was from January 27th, 1991, which is when I was sentenced. All that takes us from there all the way up until 2001.
Oh my gosh. 10 years.
Yes. So I so the only way into court when your appeals are over is you have to find some previously unknown evidence of innocence, or you have to hope that there's been some kind of change in the law that will apply to old cases as well. So because I wasn't finding any new evidence myself personally while locked up in a men's maximum security prison, and because my family and I could not afford an attorney, I began writing letters looking for an attorney to represent me for free and trying to find an investigator that would work on the same basis. And obviously the hope was that working together that they could find some new evidence of innocence so I could get back into court. So I wrote letters, uncountable amount of letters for 4 years, rarely getting a response other than the occasional no. And then I went to the parole board, where in part because I maintained my innocence rather than expressing remorse and taking responsibility, I was denied parole as well. So let me get to how I was exonerated. One of my letters that I wrote to a book author in care of the publishing company someone at the publishing company instead sent the letter to an investigator, Claudia Whitman. So she wrote me back right away. And once I showed her legal documents showing that the DNA didn't match me, she believed in my innocence instantly. In fact, she doubted that somebody could be convicted if there was a DNA test, because people were being exonerated left and right by DNA. So she said that, so she agreed to be my champion. She said, look, I can't work on your case directly. You're too far away. But what I'll do is I will try to help you do the networking. So she tried to get people to take my case, and she gave me ideas. And one of her ideas was the winning one. So she suggested that I write the Innocence Project again, a nonprofit organization in Manhattan that frees wrongfully convicted prisoners in cases where DNA can demonstrate innocence. I previously wrote them looking for help in 1992-93. But the issue was that DNA was not as sophisticated as it was before, and their method of case selection and their method of exonerating people was simply get evidence, test it, submit it into court under the newly discovered evidence legal argument, and exonerate people.
Yeah.
But because the DNA already didn't match me and had already been in front of the jury, doing that was not an option because it wouldn't have been anything new.
Mm-hmm.
So in a way, you might say the DNA excluded me a little too fast for my own good,
Oh my gosh.
if you want to think of it that way. So I was, they had turned me down. They never before came across a case where there had been an exclusion and yet a conviction. And so, trying to be fair to them, they really didn't know what to do.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I made the rounds amongst other innocence entities, and they also turned me down. So the investigator told me that with the advent of advancement in DNA technology, that the prior denial was irrelevant. So I should just simply write again. So I wouldn't have thought to write them again, thinking I would get a similar response.
Sure.
So I wrote them, then I filled out their questionnaire, and then I forgot about it. I continued to look for other ways of obtaining legal representation, none of which worked. So I didn't know it then, but I've learned since that in the 6 months prior, in between when I filled out the questionnaire and when they agreed to represent me, the lawyers once again did not want to take my case because of the pre-existing DNA exclusion. But there was an intake worker there by the name of Maggie Taylor who presented my case. She represented my case to them twice. Wow. Coming up with new theories as to how the DNA could be used to still constitute something new. So 6 months later, seemingly out of the blue, they contacted me and they told me that they were taking my case. So getting the legal representation was the first key thing. Second key thing was that Pirro left office and her successor did not have her heels dug in. And as I understand it, neither one of them liked the other. And Pirro was in the middle of running for Attorney General at that time against Andrew Cuomo. So I believe that she was hoping that I would be exonerated to then ruin her Attorney General run. That was, I believe that was part of the backstory on that. And the third thing was that we got lucky that the actual perpetrator, his DNA was in the data bank because left free while I was doing time for his crime, he killed a second victim who was a school teacher and had 2 children. So on September 22nd, 2006, the conviction was overturned and I was released. I reported back to court November 2nd, 2006, at which point all the charges were dismissed against me on actual innocence grounds. And I was released at that point with nothing to try to rebuild my life.
Thanks for killing the small talk. DIE-ALOGUE is a Yellowtape Media production edited by Jason Usry and produced and hosted by me, Rebekah Sebastian. Please be sure to subscribe to DIE-ALOGUE, a true crime conversation, wherever you listen to podcasts, and follow us on social media. We are at DIE-ALOGUE Pod across all platforms. You can also drop me a note or a guest suggestion or sign up for my newsletter at RebekahSebastian.com. Be sure to join me every Wednesday for a new episode and another killer conversation.